most crucially, what Ukraine needs is heavy artillery ammunition. That's quite difficult to get hold of. It's in short supply and high demand. Clearly, I suspect, given the numbers, the 4 million rounds, that's likely to include small arms ammunition as well. I mean, bullets to keep assault rifles firing. But the UK has also talked about drones, made a real focus on its support for Ukraine's autonomous weapons. We've provided the Storm Shadow missiles before, which have played a crucial role in some of Ukraine's most spectacular strikes, not least against Russian naval assets, ships, submarines, and indeed a Navy headquarters in Sebastopol.
Now, Rishi Sunak is actually in Poland today and it will announce a £500 million package of military funding and equipment for Ukraine. The Prime Minister will also meet with his Polish counterpart, Donald Tusk, to discuss deepening UK-Poland relations and to hold talks with the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. We'll be hearing from our political editor, Kate McCann, who's travelling with the Prime Minister just after 8. But first, let's speak to Jerome Starkey, who's defence editor at The Sun. Good morning to you.
Morning, Asma.
So how does this where does this stand? £500 million package of military funding and equipment for Ukraine. Where does this stand in what's been announced before?
Well, the government saying it brings the UK aid for this financial year to £3 billion. There have been three consecutive annual packages of aid from the UK, which has placed Britain around third in the rankings in terms of bilateral aid to Ukraine after America, which is in terms of military aid out in front. But Germany has donated about 18 billion, and this would bring the UK's total contribution since the start of the full-scale invasion to somewhere north of about 9.5 billion, if my math is correct, never my strong suit. But so it is significant, and of course comes as Ukraine has ramped up its appeals for donations and specifically for military assistance. I mean, it's been a constant refrain from Kyiv since the start of the war, but it's become particularly acute in recent months, and that's really down to the deadlock we saw in Washington over a massive $61 billion aid package that was held up in Congress because of opposition from Republicans. That today is expected to pass. So after 5 months of wrangling in America, that $61 billion aid package, it's been approved by the House of Representatives. It's due to get rubber stamp approval signed off by the Senate. And that will mean that potentially American weapons will start arriving in Ukraine within days. Now, obviously, anything the United Kingdom can donate will complement that. But I think at the moment, the real game changer is what's been happening in America.
Of course. In terms then of what Rishi Sunak is announcing today, as I said, it's £500 million of military funding and equipment. Is there anything new within that, or is it what we have already supplied?
My understanding is it's more of what the UK has already supplied. I mean, the UK's focus, the weapons that the UK has donated have been incredibly wide. I mean, you talked earlier, or rather in the news bulletin, about the 4 million rounds of ammunition. I mean, most crucially, what Ukraine needs is heavy artillery ammunition. That's quite difficult to get hold of. It's in short supply and high demand. Clearly, I suspect, given the numbers, the 4 million rounds, that's likely to include small arms ammunition as well. I mean, bullets to keep assault rifles firing. But the UK has also talked about drones, made a real focus on its support for Ukraine's autonomous weapons. We've provided the Storm Shadow missiles before, which have played a crucial role in some of Ukraine's most spectacular strikes, not least against Russian naval assets, ships, submarines, and indeed a Navy headquarters in Sebastopol. But the UK is also focused specifically on maritime autonomous vehicles and supporting the campaign in the Black Sea. Now, that is where Ukraine does appear to have had some of its most spectacular successes, whilst the fighting on the front lines along the land conflict, if you like, has been pretty slow, deadly, expensive for both sides, both in terms of men and munition, and not a lot of land changing hands for huge amounts of lives and materiel. The fight that's been happening in the Black Sea has been very different, and that's where you have seen spectacularly successful attacks both on ships at sea, ships in port. There was a submarine in dry dock, the first time a Russian submarine had been destroyed since the end of World War II. And also, just within the last few days, Ukraine managed to hit an air defense battery, a Russian air defense battery in Crimea. And by taking that out, we would expect to see other high value assets have been left vulnerable, and so worth waiting to see what happens there. I mean, elsewhere, what Ukraine has been doing with success, where it's been scoring goals, if you like, has been its long range strikes deep into Russian territory. And this is something which has caused some anxiety in America, because some of these strikes have been aimed at oil refineries and at Russia's energy infrastructure. And the US concerned that that would push up prices on the global market, fuel inflation, and make life more difficult in terms of the cost of living for Americans. But nonetheless, that has been something that the Ukraine has been determined to pursue, and something where Ukraine has been having success.
Just very briefly, because some people have taken their eye off the situation in Ukraine, and you've talked about a few small victories for Ukraine. But would you say that over the last year that anything has shifted, or has it remained the same?
No, I think over the last year, the momentum, Ukraine's momentum has ground slowly to a halt, certainly in the land domain. And Russia, where there have been advances on the battlefield, they have been Russia's. So it was about a year ago, it was last May, that we saw Russia finally capturing Bakhmut, the city that had been the focus of its fury for many, many, many months. And then earlier this year, in February, we saw Russia take Avdiivka, a similar conflict, or less a similar assault, which saw many, many lives lost in order to advance into what was effectively the shell of a devastated town. But nonetheless, both of these symbolic victories for Russia, the only real movement on the battlefield over the last year has been that. I mean, Ukraine did have some success with its summer counteroffensive in sort of late summer last year. They managed to advance into a place called Orekhiv in the south central Zaporizhia district. But by and large, over the last 12 months, the movement on the battlefield in the land domain hasn't been very fast or very far, especially if you think back to the beginning of the conflict, when there were those huge assaults, counter-assaults by Ukraine in Kharkiv in the northeast and Kherson in the south, where Russian forces were swept back, scores of miles at a time. And also we saw, of course, we can't forget the Russian retreat from their initial assault on Kyiv. But those Ukrainian victories do seem, they feel further and further away in the past.
Okay, Jerome, thank you for that. That's Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun.